Hi everyone, happy to know you're all here with us today for this training. My name is Marie-Ève. I'm the Program Director at the Community Radio Fund of Canada. I started working here in 2012. I was hired as the first Program Officer, and my first mandate was to create the Radiometres Program. I'm here today with Camille, your Program Officer. Camille started working at the Fund 6 months ago, I believe, in July. So we both worked on the guidelines and the application form for this round of funding. So Camille, you can say some words.
I just want to invite you to be in touch with me if you have any problem or any concerns when filling the application form. I can review your application form with you before you officially submit it. So anytime by email or by phone, feel free to contact me.
So today we will give you information about the Radiometres program, especially tips on how to write your application. We actually have a lot to say. This presentation should last about an hour. So again, we have a lot to say. We won't be talking specifically about the new online platform. There's a guide for you on our website if you wish to read that. So yes, I think we can give it a go. I'm just gonna put the PowerPoint presentation on. Won't be too long. There you go. Okay, so let's get started. If you are not familiar with the Community Radio Fund of Canada, you should know that we are a not-for-profit organization created in 2007 by the country's 3 largest community radio associations: l'Alliance des radios communautaires du Canada, l'Association des radiodiffuseurs du Québec, and the National Campus and Community Radio Association, or the NCRA if you prefer. Although the fund was created by these 3 associations, we remain an independent organization. We have just adopted a new vision, mission, and mandate. You can check it out on our website. What's important to remember is that we are offering funding programs to provide additional financial support to stations in order to build capacity and develop the resources of this sector. Additional is an important word here. We haven't been created to help stations survive, and we cannot provide operational funding for a station. So where does our funding come from? It almost comes entirely from private broadcasters through their financial contributions for Canadian content development, so the CCD, a mechanism established by the CRTC. As mentioned by the CRTC, CCD funding is intended to support volunteers, community programming, and participation, and should focus on improving programming and training volunteers. So basically, that's what we can fund. At the request of the CRTC, we can only fund specific projects because we are here to give extra help to stations. So Radiometres was created to distribute CCD funding to the sector, and we only have one source of funding, so that's why we have one main program. So Radiometres, what's that? The program was first launched in July 2012. We are now in the 6th year of the program and the 8th round of funding. So on that slide, you can see the evolution of the guidelines. Before I talk specifically about the program, it should be mentioned that the CRTC requested that we implement an approach to funding with clear performance measures, specifically measures to evaluate the success of funding. Such measures may include, but would not necessarily be limited to, a description of incremental increases in volunteer programming levels or Canadian content levels that occur as a result of funding. So to respond to this mandate, we are using an outcomes-based approach to funding, which means that Radiometres is an outcomes-based program that focuses on specific measurable results. It has been established that CRFC revenues derived from this funding should contribute to the three following results. So here you have the three results. The first one is high quality, locally reflective music and spoken word programming. The second result is skilled and sustainable volunteer participation in local content creation and operation. And the last one, diverse community participation in governance, programming, and content. Just so you know, these three results have been approved and validated by the CRTC. Okay, so the guidelines. We cannot tell you how important it is to read the program guidelines before you start writing your funding application. This is the very first thing you should do. I know it's not quite exciting, but you should really take the time to read them. The guidelines include important information you need to know about the program. I especially invite you to read and follow our tips on how to write your application at page 8 of the guidelines. So briefly, here are the important elements you need to remember. The first one is that each eligible station can make one application for funding. So it's one application per station. The partnership option, where several stations could submit one project, is no longer available. You can request up to $50,000 from the CRFC. You can ask for less, but not for more. The total cost of your project may also exceed $50,000 if, for example, your station or other partners contribute to the project. We have a funding envelope of $1.75 million to distribute for this round of funding. Also, your project must take place between September 1st and August 31st. The funding period is based on our fiscal year. You can, however, choose the start and end dates of your project. For example, you may decide to do a 6-month project starting on January 15th and ending on July 15th, so that's not a problem. And just a quick note, we haven't offered Radiometres on a regular basis in the past. This will change. Radiometres is an annual program. The funding period will be the same from year to year, and the program will always be launched in January. Your project must meet at least one of the program results, and your project expenses must be directly related to the proposed project. We cannot fund current or operational expenses. There's a list of eligible and ineligible expenses that can be found on page 6 of the guidelines. We will also tell you more on the budget later in the presentation. And the last thing, the guidelines include 2 appendices, a glossary and guidelines on public recognition. You will see when completing your application form on the online platform that some words are followed by an asterisk. These words are explained in the glossary. And with respect to Appendix 2, which is the CRFC's public recognition guidelines, this is a new requirement. This year, stations, if they are funded, will have to recognize the contribution of the fund to their project. There's a question in the application form that's related to this document, so you should really read it.
We will now continue with the application form. For those of you who submitted an application in the past, you probably realized that some questions were added. So the form is a bit longer than it was in the past. We want to reassure you, the expectations remain the same. So it's just that some questions are more numerous because we realized that some of them didn't get the answer that didn't get answer as precise as we were expecting. This is why we divided them in more questions, but it should really help you detail more the information that you provide, but essentially the information requested remains the same. You can now see all the sections of the form listed here. We will go through them during this presentation. We won't see every question one by one. I just selected those that I think are more important or that deserve more attention. And one last thing before we go on, there's an optional question this year. You can send us a video or an audio file. We know that you guys are radio people and that sometimes you're more comfortable explaining your project than writing about it. So you can just log into the platform, and under your logo where there's your progress bar, under it there's the add an audio file or add a video file. So you can upload your file over there. And for this year, this question won't be evaluated, but may be sure that this file will be sent to the selection committee. Before we go directly into the application form, I thought that maybe we can discuss a bit about what a project is to make sure we have a common understanding before we go on. So a project is a complex, non-repetitive, and unique effort, and it's bounded by time, budget, and resources constraint, and it has the purpose of responding to a need. We will come back on this notion of need and the importance of identifying it right at the beginning of your project. But for now, we will focus on making the distinction between a project and the operational activity of a radio station or any organization. So operational activities are the operations that allow the organization to work from one year to another. So these activities are not punctual, they have a repetitive nature, and it goes on in a continuous process. For a project, it's different. It responds to a specific need or purpose. It's a one-time activity, so it's non-repetitive, and it's planned over a limited period of time. So it means that a project has a start and end date. Just to illustrate that, I thought that we might take an example from everyday life. So my example is quite simple. It's the example of a baker that makes bread every morning and sells it. So for him, it's operational activity to wake up very early every morning, to make its bread, put it in the oven and sell it. But it becomes a project when one of his customers, who's gluten intolerant, come to him and says, well, I would like to buy bread from you, but there's no type of bread that I can consume. Can you please design the bread for me? And then the baker will have to test different recipe. He will have probably to find a name for this bread, maybe design a label. So all of this would be a project. But when the recipe is done, he found a name, he has the label, then it will become operational activity to produce that bread like he produces all the others. And as you notice, it doesn't mean that when the baker was doing his project of designing his new bread, he didn't stop his operational activity. So he went on with the activities and he had a project at the same time.
Camille's example is really great. I think it illustrates what's the difference between a project and operational activities, but I can give you an example that's closer to what you're doing. So you are a radio station and you broadcast over the air. You have a programming schedule. Think of that as your regular activities. If you decide to set up a new show, that's a project because you are developing something new. You can also modify one of your regular shows, say your morning show, for example, by adding an open line or live interviews. That's also a project because that's different from what you are currently doing.
We will now continue with the life cycle of a project. So a project starts with the initiation phase, then goes on to the planning phase, there's implementation, and finally the closing phase. During the initiation phase, it's the moment where you set the goals for your project, you define the tasks, and you assign responsibilities. During the planning phase, you determine more specific goals and you think about the means you will have to in order to achieve the goals that were set. So the application form that we have here is designed in a way that it will help you cover the initiation phase and to start the planning of your project. So your project should have a sufficient level of detail so we have a clear idea of what you would be doing. And always keep in mind that if you were to give your application form to another station manager, he should be able, reading this document, to go on with the project and deliver it. So always keep in mind that it should be clear enough that if another person was to realize the project, he would have all the information required. So there are a few questions that you should ask yourself even before starting filling the application form. So why are you doing the project? With whom will you be doing it? For whom? With what? How? And when? So these are essential questions that demonstrate the feasibility of your project, and the application form will then help you develop all those aspects more precisely. One thing important to know, and it's probably like if you can only remember that from this presentation today, that would be probably it. So the importance to have a coherent application. So at any time during your application, you have to take into consideration the coherence between the measurable results that you set for your project, so your goals, in accordance with your budget and your timeline. So you should ask yourself, do the objectives that we set ourselves justify the financial investment that we're asking for? Is the work we want to accomplish achievable within the time frame we have? Does the time frame that we have allow us to complete the project without exceeding the allocated budget? So there's no need to inflate the goals, hoping to be selected, because if the goal seems too high in accordance with your budget or your timeline, then we might think, well, this is too ambitious, they won't be able to deliver it, this project is not realistic, and it might not be selected. On the other hand, if you're asking for too much funding for very low results, then we might think, well, it should probably be better to invest in another project that will deliver more results.
I can give you a quick example of what Camille just said. So for example, let's say two stations submit a 52-week project requiring an investment from the CRFC of $42,000. One wants to complete 2 hours of new programming, and the second station wants to produce 48 hours of new programming. So which project would you choose? I'm guessing you would say the project with 48 hours of new programming. It seems obvious. But what if I say that the 2 hours of new programming consist of 2-minute interventions that require a lot of research as well as contacting and meeting various specialists, which takes a lot of time and resources. The 48 hours of new programming of the second station could be a 1-hour music show. So in light of these explanations, your choice could be different. The important thing to remember here is that there are no ideal programming hours. It's all about demonstrating what you want to accomplish and justifying the budget needed to get there as well as the time needed.
A few warnings before we go on and really enter into the application form. One common mistake that we see is to present the employment of somebody as a project. So hiring somebody in order to make something is not a project in itself. What you have to expose in your application form is the goals that you want to achieve with your project and present the activities that will be done through the course of your project. And then there's a chart for human resources and also one for your budget. So this is where we will see that you will be hiring people in order to conduct the project and make it happen. But hiring the people, it's not the project, it's the activities that they will be doing that represents the project. One other common mistake that we see is totally the opposite, is taking a look at all the tasks that will be accomplished by one person working at your station during the entire year and try to group them to make it look like a project. It's usually a kind of project that looks like a huge grocery list. So be careful with that because there's no link between the activities and there's no innovation in this list because it's not things that it's not something new. You present the operational activity of your station, then for us it's not a project and it will be rejected.
So those are the two most common mistakes.
So now we will be entering really the application form. So section 1, your station. You don't have to detail the situation of your station since its creation. You should really keep it simple, concise. Just make sure to include the information that is pertinent regarding the project that you are presenting. So here again, think about coherence all the time. So even though we're asking you to describe your station, it should be coherent with the project that you are presenting. So focus really on what's important and what makes you unique. Because one good project for a station might not be a good project for another station in another context. Now, section 2, your project. We will take a closer look at question 7, which is related to identifying the needs that underlie your project. So to me, this is one of the most important steps when planning a project, because even though you have a very good idea, then if it doesn't respond to any need that was expressed in your community or in your radio station, then even though you put a lot of energy into it and a lot of effort, it might be a great project, but why are you investing all of those effort if it does not respond to a need? So a need is just identify something you want to modify, to change, to improve. Be aware of your current situation and where you would like to go, so your desired situation. And this need is the gap between your current situation and the desired situation, and the project you present us should be the mean that will allow you to go from this A point to this B point. So it's sad to say, but having a good idea is not enough. You have to be able to demonstrate how your project is worth it and the impact it will have. Now question 8. When you take a look at the results that were presented earlier to you by Marie-Ève, you may think, well, my project, I think, fits into one or more of the results. So we are aware it might be hard to make a choice, but you don't have to make a choice right at the beginning when you start planning or the definition of your project. We encourage you to go further into the reflection of your project. To the thinking of your project, detail the activities, really take a look at your budget, your timeline, and you will see that there's probably an element that is stronger than the others. So as your project becomes clearer, it should be easier to identify the result. There's also one question after question 8 where you have to explain the choice of the result that you made and illustrate the link between the selected result and your project. So this is where you can say, well, my project responds to result 1, for instance, but there's also an aspect of result number 2. So you can always bring this element that, well, there's this second result that is also in link with my project. So all the time, to all levels, try to be coherent and make sure that there's always a common thread through your project. So from the result that you selected, say if it's programming, volunteer, community, it should be in link with the need that you identified, and everything in between should have that same link. So you take a look at the goals that you set yourself, and the measurable result will be in fact having a number to the goals that you identified, and more precisely you will then see all the activities that you will have to put in place in order to meet your goals. In section 3, I'm sure when you take a look at expected result, then you might think, well, do we have to fill all that? We did try here to have the most common aspect to all the projects. So this is why we have the programming, the volunteerism, the partnership, and the community participation. But feel free just to fill the sections that really are related to your project. So you will see each of those sections start with a yes/no question. So if you click on yes, then you will see other questions appearing. If you click on no, those questions won't appear. So just feel what applies to you, and even though you selected result number 1, programming, and there are some volunteer participation over there, then select volunteerism as well, and you can indicate the information related to your volunteers. Next, measurable results. In the previous slide, we encourage you to fill the information that we think was commonly spread across the projects. But in this section here, in question 18, we really encourage you to identify results that are particular to your project and that will make you unique. And all the time, make sure that you are able to include the information regarding your current situation, so the starting point, and to be able to give us a clear idea of where you want to be at the end of your project. And why are we asking that? It's in order to be able to measure the progress that will be made through your project. One common tool used in project management in order to really help you phrase your results is being smart. So S stands for specific, M for measurable, A for attainable, R for relevant, and T for time bounded. So the goal should target a specific area of improvement or answer a specific need, so they have to be precise. You should be able to put a number in front of what you present, and it should be attainable, and attainable for one station is not the same attainable for another station that has different resources available. So be sure to always consider the resources you have available at your station. Make sure your project is relevant, so align with the objective of your organization. So this brings us to the section 1, where we spoke about giving us information about your station, and make sure that your results are time-bounded, that they have a defined start and end date, because something that might seem ambitious through the course of the year might not be ambitious during the course of 3 years. So one example from day-to-day is, let's say somebody says, well, I want to run faster. And then somebody says, well, I want to run 10 kilometers faster. So then we have a better idea of the objective. But then if it's run 10 kilometers within 50 minutes, run 10 kilometers in 50 minutes by September 2008. And it can also be even more precise by saying, lower my time from 44 minutes to 40 minutes for a 10-kilometer distance by September 2018. We will now take a look at the timeline. So for those of you who in the past submitted application, you probably noticed that this question is presented different this year. What we are trying to encourage you to do here is to subdivide the main work of your project into components that are easier to master. And it should make it easier to estimate the time needed to complete each of these tasks. So you can do an exhaustive inventory of the tasks that will be performed. And then in the next column, you can identify the title of the person that will be in charge of this activity or this step. And then you see that you have all the months that you can cover during your project. So just indicate the months to which this activity or step is applicable. So for instance, if your project starts last week of November, goes on through December and ends first week of January, then you can check those 3 months. So you can have multiple boxes checked on the same one. In the same section regarding the timeline, this is where we put a chart that is also new this year. It's about human resources. In the past, this information was required as well, but we were asking for it directly into your budget. We did try to present it like that this year, hoping it will lighten the presentation of your budget. So the information is here, but you won't have to repeat it in the budget. What you have to do is just to calculate the total of this chart, the total of the amount that you will need for the salary, and then just put in the question regarding the budget. So in your budget, all the salaries will appear in a single line. So here you can identify the title of the position of the person, then complete the information regarding the wage per hour that you want to offer, estimate the numbers of hours that they will be working on the project, and just report this information into your budget later on. One thing we want to make maybe clearer, because we noticed that sometimes it was not always taken into consideration, is, for instance, if your station manager is working 10 hours per week on the project. Of course, this person is not hired especially for the project, but will be contributing sometimes in the project. Then those 10 hours worked by the station manager in order to make the project happen can be charged on the project. So you just have to identify the title of the position. So station manager, you can put the 10 hours per week with the wage. So it doesn't have to be a person that is especially hired for the project. It can be people already working in your station, as long as they are spending time working on the project. Oh, and okay. So we will continue with the budget. So we spoke about that earlier. The first line is for salary. So just put the number that you obtained in the previous question. So it was question 22. And one thing also new this year is that we had budget categories. We chose those categories through because we have made an analysis of the previous project, and we found that those were the most common expenses. But if you have an expense that does not fit into any of those categories, at the bottom of the chart, there are a few extra lines for others. So you can always put the expense there. And if you need more lines, you just take a look at the next question, and there's a question where it says, do you need more lines? So you can check yes, and you will have the extra lines that you need. For every line of expense, we encourage you to give us relevant detail about the expense. There's just for the line of salary, where you don't have to add anything if you don't if you don't have anything additional to say, because we will just take a look at the previous question, so we will have all the information that we need. Then you can indicate the amount that you request from the CRFC, and there's a column where you can indicate the amount your station will be contributing, as well as if you have other partners. We encourage you really to estimate if your station will have to chip into the project, because one common mistake that we see is that people fill the application taking into consideration the amount that they request from the CRFC, and they think, well, if this station has to chip in, we'll see when it happened, and we will put the money that has to be invested. But this can trigger the coherence of your project, because when we will be seeing your budget, we might think, well, your project is not realistic because the budget will not allow you to meet the targets and goals according to the goals that were set. So be sure to evaluate if your station has to put money into the project, and to make it clear into the budget form. And finally, last column, if you have partners, we indicate we invite you to indicate the name of those partners and to tell us if the amount was confirmed or not. Oh, and one last thing that is new this year is that is regarding the technical equipment. So in the past, it was a fixed amount. This changed this year, so it's a maximum of 5% that you are requesting from the CRFC. We will now take a look at the project implementation. So we invite you, when you're filling in the application form, to already think about the mechanisms or the tools that we'll have to put in place in order to measure the performance of your project. So you have to do it right at the beginning in the application when you fill the application form, because if we think about it during the closing phase, then we might not have the information that we want, and we don't have the tools that allow us to measure the progress. So it's important to do it right at the beginning.
And these tools don't have to be complex. So we don't want to be complicating your life. We just want to see if you'll be able to manage your project. So these tools could be, for example, an Excel spreadsheet, team meetings that you are already having, or documents shared on a server.
One last thing, it's the risk management. So what is a risk? It's the likelihood of an harmful event that would occur and that would challenge the achievement of an organization objective or of the project. So there's a question here where we invite you to identify the risk of your project, and here what we really want to analyze is your capacity to identify what can go wrong during the project and what can be put in place in order to reduce the probability that it happened. So it's not because you identify a lot of risk that we say, well, the project seems risky, we won't select it. Or the opposite, where a station does not identify any risk and we say, well, the project is not risky, so let's take it. Really what we take into consideration here is your capacity to analyze what can go wrong and what can be done in order to prevent it.
And to help you out, we've added some examples in the sub-question. So you can choose from the list and explain further how it applies to your project. Okay, so let's say you have submitted your application for funding. You can see here the selection criteria. They are available on our website as well as in the program guidelines, so I won't be reading them now. You should keep in mind these criteria when you write your application. And just so you know, the 3 first elements count for 40% of our assessment. You should also note that your history with the CRFC counts. If you did not communicate major changes to your funded project, or if you've sent reports late, for example, you can be penalized for that. And it's up to 20% of your final score. So let's say you have 100%, it can be lowered to 80%. If you are a new applicant or have never received funds from us, your score will stay the same. The selection of applications is made through a competitive process. Only the best applications are funded. Once your application has been sent, the CRFC team here will make a thorough assessment of your application. We rely on the quality of the information presented in the application, and an evaluation grid is used to assess your application. We can also request further information on your application. If that happens, you will have a week to provide any additional information that we request. And at the end of this step, there's a list of ranked applications that is prepared. So once the CRFC team has assessed application, we set up a selection committee made up of 3 people who are not associated with any campus or community radio stations. For example, they're not employees or board members of radio stations. These 3 persons will make the final funding recommendations. So they will be reading your applications in addition to our assessments, and they will add comments on the application. Their goal is really to see which projects deserve to receive funding given the funding envelope that we have, so the 1.75 million. There's a final in-person meeting planned to discuss application and prepare a list of approved projects that will be ratified by our board of directors here at the CRFC. And just to give you an idea, in the last round of funding, 37% of eligible funding applications were approved. So that means that we approved 34 projects out of 93. It was also the highest number of applications ever received as part of a funding round, and we can think it would be similar this year, so we should be funding approximately 40 projects. Okay, so last slide, the program timeline. So the most important date is March 8th. It's the deadline to submit your application. You must submit your application before 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Applications that are sent late, even 1 minute, will be rejected. So to avoid any panic attacks, you should really send your project proposal in advance. I'm not going to read all the dates, you can read them, but I'm sure you will be interested in knowing when you should be receiving an answer. That will be happening mid-June. So you should receive an email saying if yes or no your application was approved. That's it for us. So if you have any questions regarding the Radiometres programs, we really invite you to contact Camille or I, and we will be happy to answer all of your questions or concerns. So thank you very much for attending this training session today.